I wasn't invited to my sister's wedding. They laughed, they ignored me, and for a moment, I almost believed I was nothing. But then I built an empire in silence. I met Nathaniel Brooks, the billionaire who saw what they never could. And while Victoria walked down the aisle in Seattle, I stood barefoot in the Maldives, a diamond on my hand, and the world watching. This wasn't revenge. This was proof. And that proof would change everything. I stood in the corner of my small apartment in San Francisco, my phone glowing in my hand. Photo after photo filled the family group chat. My sister Victoria Hayes, 33, was radiant in a champagne-colored gown, Garrett Cole's arm wrapped proudly around her waist. My parents stood beside them, their smiles beaming like they'd won some prize. Everyone was there, cousins, aunts, uncles, all laughing, glasses raised. Except me. I scrolled in disbelief. No envelope had come in the mail. No email. Not even a simple text. 2 nights earlier, I'd sat at that same dinner table in Seattle for the first time in months. I'd booked a last-minute flight hoping maybe this time would be different. Mom's house was just as I remembered. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary, the clink of polished silverware, and the sound of Dad's voice booming from the dining room. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say on the plane about my promotion at the agency, the campaign I'd led, that had just been approved by one of the biggest tech companies in San Francisco. For once, I thought maybe I'd have something they couldn't ignore. I barely got 2 sentences out before Mom interrupted. "That's nice, Madeline," she said, her tone airy, already pivoting away. "But wait until you hear what Victoria's been planning." Victoria leaned in her ring, catching the chandelier's light. The diamond was massive, almost theatrical. Garrett, her fiancé, smiled in that polite, rehearsed way of his. "Garrett's parents are hosting the engagement dinner at their vineyard in Napa." Mom added, practically glowing. "It's going to be magical." I forced a smile and nodded, but inside something twisted. I wanted to tell them about the late nights at the office, the meetings where I'd fought for my ideas and finally been heard. But every word felt smaller than the sparkle of Victoria's ring. Dad lifted his glass. "Your sister has always been a star," he said proudly. "Garrett, you're a lucky man." "And I'm luckier for marrying into this family," Garrett replied smoothly. Everyone laughed. Everyone except me. I tried to join the conversation again, later mentioning a potential expansion at work, but Dad waved it away. "Marketing's nice, Maddie. But Victoria's wedding, that's history." That word history stung. As if my life, my choices didn't even exist in their story. After dinner, while I washed the dishes, Victoria stood in the doorway, arms crossed casually. "You know, Maddie," she said almost kindly, "this wedding is just for family. It's not personal." "Not personal?" I stared at her, but she was already texting someone, nails clicking against the screen. The next day I told myself she didn't mean it. Maybe there was still a mistake. Maybe an invitation would come. But then the photos hit social media. The heavy cardstock, the gold lettering, the perfect calligraphy. Everyone had one. Except me. When I texted her, she answered in seconds. "The wedding's intimate. Just family. Just family." I stared at those 2 words until my vision blurred. That night I stood by my window. The city stretched out before me, glittering against the dark. My reflection looked back at me, tired and small. I pressed my forehead to the glass, listening to the hum of traffic below. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger was sharp. Clean. This was heavier than that. A dull, aching weight in my chest, the kind that came from years of knowing where you stood in your own family and how far you were from the center. Memories flickered. Victoria at 16 was crowned homecoming queen, my parents cheering louder than anyone else in the stands. I at 15, clutching an award for a statewide marketing competition, while they left early because Victoria had a piano recital. It was always like this. She was the sun. I was everything else. I looked down at my phone again. One new photo. Victoria and Garrett are holding hands, champagne flutes raised. The caption read, "To family forever." Family. I laughed, a small broken sound. Maybe they didn't see me now, but I wasn't going to keep disappearing quietly, not anymore. I walked to my desk, sat down, and opened my laptop. My hands were trembling, but my mind was sharp in a way it hadn't been in years. If my family wanted to forget I existed, fine. But they were about to remember me in a way none of them would ever be able to ignore. And for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. Eleanor called the next evening. Her voice was soft in that careful way she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable. She said she thought it would be nice to have a family dinner just to clear the air. I agreed, not because I believed in her sudden desire for peace, but because I wanted to see them with my eyes open this time. The Hayes house in Bellevue looked the same as it always had. Perfectly trimmed hedges, a front door polished to a shine, and the faint scent of Eleanor's expensive candles drifting out as soon as I stepped inside. My father, Charles, was in the living room, glass of whiskey in hand, while Victoria stood near the fireplace in a sleek cream dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Garrett lounged beside her with an easy smirk, his hand resting casually in his pocket, like he owned the place. Eleanor greeted me with a tight smile. I could feel her eyes scanning my outfit, a simple navy dress I had chosen carefully. Respectable enough to avoid comment, but not so polished that I looked like I was trying to impress them. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, the one we only use for holidays, and moments like this, where every polished surface seemed designed to reflect judgment. We sat around the long mahogany table, Charles at the head, Eleanor beside him, Victoria and Garrett across from me, and Lily, my 24-year-old cousin, tucked quietly near the end. The meal started the way these dinners always did, with polite conversation that cut just enough to sting. Garrett launched into a story about his latest real estate deal in Los Angeles, a luxury condo project that had apparently sold out in record time. He leaned back in his chair, his smile smug and satisfied. "You should have seen the numbers," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "When you work with people who know how to play at this level, success becomes second nature." Victoria laughed and brushed his arm. "Not everyone can handle that kind of pressure, Garrett. Right, Maddie? You must be busy with all those little marketing campaigns of yours." Her words dripped with sugar and venom. My father chuckled, as if she had just told a clever joke. Charles set his glass down and looked at me with that familiar expression of mild disappointment. "You could learn a lot from your sister. She has always known how to pick the right path. Maybe if you followed her example, you'd be further along by now." I cut a piece of roasted chicken and placed it on my plate without looking up. My fork trembled only slightly, but I kept my face calm. I had learned long ago that silence hurt them more than anger ever could. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lily glance at me. Her phone buzzed softly against the table. I slipped mine into my lap and read her message. "Do not let them make you small." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat and typed back under the table. "I won't." The conversation moved on. Eleanor asked Garrett about the vineyard where he and Victoria would host their rehearsal dinner. Garrett described it in lavish detail, savoring every word. Charles nodded approvingly while Victoria basked in their attention like a queen holding court. And then Garrett turned to me. "You know, Maddie, maybe what you really need is someone to help you." He smiled in a way that wasn't kind. "Someone who can rescue you from all this struggling." The table went quiet, waiting for me to laugh along, waiting for me to take it the way I always had, with my head down and my mouth shut. I set my fork down gently. I stood. Every chair creaked as the room shifted. Victoria tilted her head, a tiny smirk playing at her lips. Garrett leaned back in his seat, satisfied. Charles's brows drew together in confusion, while Eleanor pressed her napkin to her lap, already sensing the disruption she had hoped to avoid. But I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't give them what they expected. Instead, I looked at Garrett, then at Victoria, then at my parents, my voice calm and steady. "Thank you for dinner." And I walked away. I heard Eleanor call my name, but I didn't turn back. I didn't owe them that. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I crossed the hallway, each step sharper than the last. When I reached the front door, I paused for a single breath. Not to reconsider, but to remind myself of something I had almost forgotten. This was no longer about wanting their approval. It was about something else entirely. When I opened the door, Lily's message lit my phone again. One word this time. Good. I stepped into the night air, the chill biting against my skin, and I let the silence settle around me. For the first time, it didn't feel heavy, it felt clean, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next would no longer be on their terms. Rain slid down my coat in steady streams as I walked through the quiet streets of Seattle. The city lights blurred against the wet pavement, their reflections stretching like ribbons beneath my feet. I pulled my scarf tighter, but the cold didn't matter. It was the silence that I wanted. The kind of silence that made old memories rise up like ghosts. I thought of the years I spent at the University of Washington, where I worked part-time at a coffee shop while carrying a full course load in marketing. Back then, I believed every small victory would matter. The internship I earned at a top agency, the scholarship I fought for without a single ounce of help from my parents, the late nights I spent perfecting my presentations until my eyes burned. But none of it ever seemed to count at home. I could still hear my father's voice after I brought home my first real job offer. "That is fine, Maddie, but Victoria just got promoted again." My mother's nod, polite but distracted, like I was a guest in my own family. Even my graduation felt like a footnote. They attended, smiled for the photos, then spent most of the dinner afterward talking about Victoria's plans with Garrett. I stopped at the corner of Pine Street, letting the rain soak into my hair. I remembered the day Victoria bought her first condo. My parents threw her a celebration as if she had conquered the world. When I leased my tiny apartment in San Francisco, they sent a group text that said good luck. I used to think it was my fault, that maybe I was the kind of person who simply didn't shine bright enough to be seen. But standing there in the rain, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit until now. They never looked because they never expected to. By the time I reached my hotel, my boots were soaked through. I climbed the stairs slowly, every step pressing my determination deeper into my bones. When I entered the room, I pulled out my laptop and sat at the small desk by the window. Seattle glimmered below, wet and relentless, but I didn't look away. I opened a blank document. At first, the cursor blinked against the white screen waiting. Then I started to type. Step 1. Build wealth. Not just enough to live comfortably, but enough to make sure no one could ever question my choices again. Step 2. Power. I would build it piece by piece until I could walk into a room and no one would dare dismiss me. Step 3. Make them see me. Not by asking, not by begging, but by becoming undeniable. I stared at the words until they stopped looking like a fantasy and started to feel like a plan. The knock on the door pulled me back. Sophie Lane leaned against the frame with 2 cups of coffee in hand, her brown hair pulled into a messy bun, and that look in her eyes that had seen me at my worst and never flinched. "You are still working?" she asked, stepping inside and setting the coffee down. I turned the screen toward her. She read in silence, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "If anyone can do this, Maddie, it's you." Her certainty hit me harder than any insult my family had ever thrown at me. I closed the laptop and looked out at the city. The rain hadn't stopped. It rarely did here. I didn't care. I pressed my hand to the cold glass, my reflection staring back at me, steady and unblinking. I would not wait for their approval. I would not play by their rules. I would make them look at me, and when they did, they would never forget it. In that moment, I made myself a promise, quiet but unshakable beneath the endless Seattle rain. Tomorrow it would begin. When I landed back in San Francisco the next morning, the city felt different. Or maybe it was me. The skyline was the same, the fog still rolled in over the bay, but there was a sharpness in my chest that hadn't been there before. I went straight from the airport to the office of Novalink, the tech startup where I had been working for the past year. Novalink's open floor plan buzzed with restless energy. Screens flickered with data developers argued over lines of code, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and ambition. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and told myself this was where it would start. No more hesitation, no more waiting. That was when Oliver Grant noticed me. He was the company's senior advisor, 42 sharp, in both mind and presence, a man who could turn a room silent with one sentence. He had built 2 companies from scratch and sold them for millions before deciding to mentor founders and handpick a few employees to shape. No one ever understood why he chose who he chose. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk while I was buried in performance reports. "Do you want to learn how to stop thinking small, Maddie?" His voice was calm, almost casual, but his eyes locked on mine like he was testing me. I nodded. "Yes. Good. Come by my office tonight. Bring a notebook." That was how it began. I started staying late long after most of the team had gone home. Oliver would sit across from me with his sleeves rolled up explaining how money actually moved in this city. He taught me how to read balance sheets, the way some people read novels, how to spot weaknesses in a business plan, and how investors really thought. At first, I failed spectacularly. During one strategy meeting, I miscalculated a projection, and my manager Claire Dawson raised an eyebrow in front of the entire team. "We cannot afford mistakes like that, Maddie." The words landed like a stone in my stomach. Some of my coworkers didn't bother hiding their smirks. I heard the whispers at lunch. "Marketing girl wants to play finance. Let's see how long that lasts." Even Ethan, the one colleague I thought I could trust, seemed amused by my late nights with Oliver. "You are working yourself to death, Maddie," he said with a laugh. "Maybe just stay in your lane." I ignored them. But the worst came a month later, when a promotion I had been quietly hoping for slipped through my hands. It went to Ethan. The same Ethan who had been sharing coffee with me after hours, who had nodded along while I showed him my plans, had turned around and pitched one of my ideas to Claire as his own. The night I found out, I sat alone in my apartment with my laptop still open, the city lights blinking through my window like they were mocking me. I felt small again, the way I used to at my parents' dinner table. My chest ached. For a moment, I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't built for this. Then something inside me hardened. I closed my eyes and I saw my sister's face, the smirk, the careless way she had said, "Just family." I saw my father's look of quiet disappointment, my mother's silence, Garrett's condescending smile. No. I pushed my chair back, made a pot of coffee, and opened a new tab on my laptop. I signed up for 2 late-night business courses: strategic growth, advanced finance. I would not be outworked. The next 3 months were brutal. I lived on caffeine and determination, splitting my time between Novalink and my courses. I watched every tutorial, read every case study, and kept a running list of my mistakes pinned above my desk so I could never repeat them. Oliver noticed. "You are not sleeping," he said one night, leaning back in his chair. "Not much," I admitted. "Good." He smiled faintly. "Then you might be learning." By the end of the quarter, the results spoke for themselves. I not only corrected the mistakes I had made before I doubled the efficiency of one of our campaigns, the same manager who had doubted me handed me my performance review with a look of surprise she didn't bother to hide. "Exceeds expectations," she said. "I have a project for you, Maddie, a big one." When she laid out the details, my pulse roared in my ears. It was a high-stakes client, the kind of project that could make or break a career. I left the meeting holding the folder in both hands, my reflection in the glass walls of the office almost unrecognizable. The exhaustion was still there, but so was something sharper, something alive. That night I worked later than anyone else in the building. The city outside was quiet, the streets slick with fog and neon, but I didn't hear a sound. I only heard the steady rhythm of my own determination. And for the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was building. Seattle was colder than I remembered. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that pressed down on the city like a weight. I had flown in for what was supposed to be a simple family dinner, but nothing about my family was ever simple. When I arrived at my parents' house, the table was already set. Eleanor's polished silver, Charles's favorite bottle of wine, and the sound of Victoria's laughter floating down the hallway, like a song written to remind me I didn't belong. I smiled tightly, sat through the meal, and stayed silent when Garrett bragged about a new investment that sounded too perfect to be real. It wasn't until later, when the guests had left and I was helping Lily gather dishes in the kitchen, that she leaned close enough for only me to hear. "Maddie," she whispered, "I think something's wrong with Garrett." I froze, plate in hand. What do you mean? Her eyes darted toward the dining room where Garrett was laughing with my father. He's been borrowing money from one of Trevor's friends. A lot of it. And Trevor heard someone mention that a bank sent a warning notice. I kept my voice even. Are you sure? She nodded. I wouldn't tell anyone else, but I thought you should know. That night, lying in the guest room where the wallpaper hadn't changed since I was a teenager, I stared at the ceiling. Garrett with his smug smile and his perfect tailored suits in trouble, I almost didn't believe it. But Lily wouldn't have told me if it weren't true. By the time I landed back in San Francisco, my mind was already turning. The next morning I called Ethan Parker. Ethan was 32, sharp and relentless. We had met at a tech networking event, but it was his work as an investigative financial journalist that made him invaluable now. He picked up on the second ring. I need you to look into someone, I said. He didn't even hesitate. Name Garrett Cole. There was a pause, then a low whistle. Your brother-in-law. I smiled faintly. Not quite yet, but soon. Within a week, Ethan sent me a secure file. Late at night, with the city quiet outside my window, I opened it. The first page was enough to make me sit back in my chair. Garrett was drowning. Over-leveraged loans. A line of credit he was using to plug holes instead of build anything. 2 pending legal notices from a regional bank. All of it hidden behind the polished image he paraded around my family like armor. I closed the file and stared at the screen for a long time. I could have sent it straight to my parents. I could have exposed him right then and there. But I didn't. Not yet. I understood something that my family never had. Timing was everything. Instead of striking, I watched. While Garrett smiled through family dinners and posted photos of wine tastings with Victoria, I kept my silence. I grew my savings, pushed through another successful quarter at Novalink, and reinvested every dollar I could into building something that was mine. Ethan called one night after sending me an update. You know I could leak this story. It would ruin him before he even saw it coming. I looked out my window at the city lights burning against the dark. Not yet. You're playing a long game, he said, a note of respect in his voice. I am, he chuckled. Then I hope he enjoys his little empire while it lasts. Weeks passed. Every time I saw Garrett, I felt the quiet power of the truth in my hands. He didn't know. My parents didn't know. Even Victoria, with her perfect hair and effortless confidence, was completely blind. But I knew. And while they went on pretending their world was untouchable, I was building the kind of strength they couldn't ignore forever. One night, long after everyone else at the office had gone home, I sat at my desk and stared at my reflection in the glass window. The city behind me glittered like a promise. They still thought I was the quiet one, the one who lost. I smiled to myself, slow and steady. They had no idea. The tech conference in downtown San Francisco was crowded with people who looked like they belonged there. Investors in tailored suits, founders with sharp eyes, and engineers who spoke in rapid-fire jargon as if the rest of the world didn't exist. I adjusted my badge, took a breath, and stepped into the main hall. Skyvault Technologies was the centerpiece of the event. Their CEO, Nathaniel Brooks, had a reputation that bordered on myth. 36 years old, private to the point of being almost invisible, but brilliant enough to turn Skyvault into one of the most valuable companies in the industry. When he walked onto the stage for the keynote panel, the room shifted. He didn't smile, didn't try to charm the audience. He didn't need to. His voice was steady, every word deliberate. He spoke about market disruptions, artificial intelligence, and the future of data infrastructure, as if he were mapping out a world no one else could see yet. During the Q&A, I raised my hand. I didn't think he would pick me, but he did. Your model assumes aggressive adoption rates, I said. But if user trust lags behind, wouldn't that put your entire growth strategy at risk? A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. No one ever interrupted Nathaniel Brooks. He looked straight at me, and for a moment it felt like the entire hall went quiet. If you were me, he asked calmly, how would you mitigate that risk? I didn't look away. By building a system that doesn't just demand trust, but earns it. People follow transparency, not promises. For the first time that day, he smiled. Not the polite kind, the kind that meant he was actually listening. Interesting, he said. After the panel fined me, I wasn't sure if he was serious, but later when the crowd dispersed, he was waiting near the coffee station. You are either very bold or very reckless, he said, handing me a cup without asking how I took it. Maybe both, I replied. Good. We need more of that in this industry. We talked for 15 minutes about technology, then another 20 about strategy, and then unexpectedly about family. I don't remember how it happened. One moment we were discussing data architecture, and the next I was telling him about Seattle, about always being second to Victoria, about how it felt to be invisible in a house full of people who never saw me. He didn't pity me. He didn't dismiss it either. He just nodded thoughtful. They don't see you, he said quietly. But I do. Something shifted then, sharp and certain, like a lock clicking open. After that day, Nathaniel and I met again. First it was coffee at a quiet cafe near his office. Then it was longer talks in the evenings after work. He didn't talk like other executives. He didn't hide behind vague advice or empty encouragement. He told me where I was wasting time, what I needed to study, and who I should be watching. You are playing catch-up, he told me one night, his voice even. But you learn faster than most. That is what will matter in the end. I asked him why he was helping me. Because I recognized the look in your eyes, he said. I had it once too. Some nights we stayed late in his corner office at Sky Vault, the city spread out below us like a circuit board lit with 1,000 possibilities. He would sketch ideas on the glass wall with a marker while I scribbled notes in my worn-out notebook. One night, while the rest of the building was dark, he paused and looked at me. You know this won't be easy, Maddie. I know. And you are not scared. I smiled. I am terrified. But I am not stopping. He laughed, then a short, quiet sound. Good. Fear means you are standing somewhere that matters. That night, walking back to my apartment under the glow of the streetlights, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not just ambition, not just anger. Something steadier. I wasn't alone anymore. Nathaniel invited me to a private dinner the following week. It was in a quiet corner of a rooftop restaurant, overlooking the bay, far away from the noise of the city. When I arrived, he was already there, seated across from a woman with sharp gray eyes and a posture that radiated authority. Maddie, meet Helena Foster, Nathaniel said. Her name was familiar. Helena Foster, 65. The kind of woman people in business circles spoke about in lowered voices. She had built and sold 3 companies, advised billionaires, and dismantled rivals without ever raising her voice. She extended her hand. I've heard you ask questions most people are too afraid to ask. I like that. Dinner with Helena was not small talk. She dissected every answer I gave, studied every pause, and by dessert I realized she wasn't just testing me. She was teaching me. Revenge, she said softly as best served in silence. Let them underestimate you until it is too late for them to recover. I listened, memorizing every word. Nathaniel watched me closely, and I could feel the quiet approval in his gaze. Over the next months, Helena became a force in my life. She taught me how to move strategically, not emotionally. Never let them see the fire, she said during one of our late-night calls. They should only feel the burn when it's too late. Meanwhile, Oliver helped me expand my financial reach. He sat with me in his office one evening, sleeves rolled up, numbers sprawled across his desk. Diversify, Maddie. Tech is good, but money must work for you in more than one arena. Under his guidance, I invested in real estate, early-stage startups, and even acquired a small stake in a logistics company. Watching my accounts grow wasn't just satisfying, it was armor. Sophie took care of the rest. She had a talent for transformation, and she turned it on me with relentless precision. Wardrobe, posture, public speaking. By the time she was done, I wasn't just another name in a crowded room. I was someone people noticed. You need to look like the future you're building, Sophie said as she adjusted the collar of a deep navy blazer on me before an event. And tonight, you're going to own it. When the New York Tech Summit came, I was ready. The ballroom at the Midtown Conference Center was dazzling, filled with industry titans, reporters, and investors. I moved through the crowd, with Nathaniel at my side, Helena watching from a distance, like a general surveying the battlefield. Conversations shifted when I spoke. People listened. Even those who had once dismissed me asked for my card. And then I saw her, Victoria. She was standing near the main stage, her designer dress flawless, her smile perfectly rehearsed. For a moment the room tilted. It felt like being back in my parents' dining room, invisible and small. But then, she saw me. Her eyes widened just slightly, but enough for me to see it. Recognition? Surprise? And something else. I didn't look away. I crossed the room slowly, not rushing, not hesitating. I didn't need to. When I reached the edge of the crowd, I caught her staring. I smiled calm and effortless, the kind of smile I'd once envied on her face. And for the first time in my life, it was her turn to be silent. The first cracks in Garrett's empire appeared quietly, like hairline fractures in glass. A failed development project in Austin forced him to liquidate several smaller assets. By the time the industry press got hold of it, he was already scrambling. Victoria tried to keep up the illusion. She posted smiling photos from charity galas, showed off new designer clothes, and spoke of Garrett's business as if nothing had changed. But I saw the tension in her eyes when I passed her at another networking event. It was Lily who confirmed it. She called me late one night from Seattle, her voice hushed. "Maddie, you didn't hear it from me, but Garrett is selling properties." Quietly. "He's in trouble." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the lights of San Francisco through my window. How bad? Bad enough that Dad and Mom will hear about it soon. People are already talking. I smiled faintly. Let them. 2 days later, Nathaniel walked into my office with a look I recognized. He closed the door and handed me his phone. "Victoria called me," he said. I raised an eyebrow. She wanted me to help Garrett restructure his finances. Nathaniel's tone was steady, but his eyes betrayed amusement. "And what did you tell her?" I told her I would think about it. "Good," I said. "We don't need to do anything. They will take care of their own destruction." Nathaniel's mouth curved into the kind of knowing smile that didn't need words. Meanwhile, rumors reached Charles and Eleanor. At first they dismissed them, but when a family friend at a country club mentioned Garrett's missing investors, their confidence wavered. I heard from Lily that Dad grilled Victoria over dinner. She swore everything was fine, but her voice cracked enough that even Mom noticed. Then came the night Garrett couldn't keep his composure. It was a private event for entrepreneurs and investors in downtown Seattle, the kind of party where reputations were strengthened or quietly dismantled. Nathaniel and I attended together, Helena watching from across the room with her usual calm detachment. Garrett arrived late, his suit perfect, but his eyes sharp with exhaustion. He greeted people too quickly, his laugh a little too loud. I stayed near the bar, sipping my drink, waiting. It didn't take long. A venture capitalist asked him about the Austin project. It was casual, almost polite, but Garrett froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "That deal was rigged from the start," he said, his voice carrying farther than it should have. "People in this room know it." A few heads turned. Garrett kept going, words spilling faster. "You all think you're better than me. I built more in 10 years than most of you will in a lifetime." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that draws blood. Nathaniel leaned toward me, his voice low and amused. "Watch." Garrett's rant ended with him slamming his glass on the table. Victoria tugged at his arm, her face pale, but he yanked it free and stormed out. The whispers started before the door even closed. When I left with Nathaniel that night, I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Because by morning, every major player in Seattle was already talking about Garrett Cole. And for the first time, my parents were listening. The charity gala at the Fairmont in San Francisco was the kind of event that filled entire pages of business magazines. Cameras flashed at every entrance, reporters whispered behind velvet ropes, and the room glimmered with wealth and power. Nathaniel stood beside me, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back, and for the first time, we stepped into the light together. Conversations paused when we walked in. Not for Nathaniel. People already knew him. They stopped because of me. I felt their eyes, their quiet curiosity, the way whispers rippled like electricity across the room. Nathaniel leaned closer. his voice low. "Are you ready?" I met his gaze and smiled. I was born ready. We moved through the crowd as if the room belonged to us. Helena was there too, standing off to the side with her usual sharp, approving look. Sophie hovered near the photographers, making sure every angle of my gown was perfect. When Nathaniel took my hand in full view of the cameras, the flashes exploded like fireworks. It was deliberate, unmistakable, and exactly what I wanted. By morning, every major news outlet in the business world carried the same headline: Skyvault CEO Nathaniel Brooks and rising power player Madeline Hayes. I didn't call my parents. I didn't have to. By noon, Eleanor's number was flashing on my screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. Maddie, her voice was sharp, but there was something brittle underneath it. We saw the news. I sipped my coffee, watching the city outside my window. "Mom," I said evenly, "let's talk later." There was a pause. "Maddie, this is later." I ended the call. 2 hours later, Lily texted me. "Dad has been pacing the kitchen. Mom looks like she's aged 10 years overnight. Victoria won't say a word." I stared at that message for a long moment before tucking my phone away. This was only the beginning. Garrett, meanwhile, was unraveling faster than even I had expected. His investors had begun to circle like vultures. Deals were stalling. Victoria was canceling appearances with him quietly, but not quietly enough. Ethan sent me another update one night with a smirk in his voice over the phone. "He is terrified of you now, Maddie. He knows you are not the same girl he used to mock." I smiled, slow and calm. Good. Nathaniel noticed it too. We were in his penthouse one evening, papers and charts spread out between us. "Garrett is losing his footing," Nathaniel said. "But I think he is more worried about you than about the banks." I closed my notebook and looked out at the skyline. He should be. It was then that I booked the tickets. Maldives, first class. Nathaniel didn't ask why I chose those dates. He didn't have to. He only glanced at the itinerary, then back at me with that quiet, knowing expression he wore whenever he saw one of my plans clicking into place. Victoria's wedding was set for the same weekend. I imagined it for a moment. While they smiled through gritted teeth in some ornate Seattle venue, I would be halfway across the world barefoot in the sand, standing next to the man every business magazine in the country was calling a visionary. It wasn't revenge. Not exactly. It was proof. And soon, they were all going to see it. The sun rose over the Maldives in a blaze of gold spilling across the water until it looked like the ocean itself was on fire. I stood barefoot on the deck of Nathaniel's yacht, the breeze warm against my skin, the world so quiet it felt like it belonged only to us. Nathaniel handed me a glass of champagne, his fingers brushing mine steady and sure. Today was Victoria's wedding day. Seattle would be buzzing by now. Makeup artists fussing over her hair flowers arriving in tall glass vases, and our parents rehearsing their proud smiles in front of the mirror. I almost laughed at the thought, not out of cruelty, but because I knew what was coming next. I slipped my phone from my pocket. Nathaniel glanced at me, a small curve tugging at his mouth. "Ready?" I didn't answer. I just raised my hand, the diamond catching the morning sun in a flash of brilliance. Nathaniel stepped close, his arm around me, and I tilted the phone slightly so the horizon framed us perfectly. One photo, clean, simple. I hit post. The image went live in seconds. Me, Nathaniel, the ocean, the ring. The first notification came before I could even lock my screen. Then another. And another. Sophie texted from New York. "You just broke the internet." I smiled and set the phone down on the deck railing. I didn't need to look at it. I could already imagine the scene playing out in Seattle. Victoria sitting in front of a mirror, her lips perfectly lined, her gown flawless. Someone handed her a phone, maybe one of her bridesmaids, their face pale and uncertain. She scrolled once, stopped. And then I imagined her fingers trembling, the air in the room changing as silence fell like a stone. Miles away, Garrett must have seen it too, his phone lighting up with alerts, the comparison headlines already spreading. Nathaniel Brooks and Madeline Hayes, power, couple of the year. Garrett Cole, from rising star to collapse. I didn't have to hear his anger to know it was boiling. Nathaniel moved behind me, his hand resting against the small of my back, grounding me in the moment. "You are quiet," he said. I looked out at the horizon. "Because I don't need to say anything." He smiled the kind of smile that belonged only to him and kissed my temple. Meanwhile, the world kept talking for me. Business networks picked up the photo. Finance blogs dissected every detail of the ring. Social media swarmed with speculation. And in the Hayes family group chat, I knew without even looking that my parents had seen it. When my phone rang, Eleanor's name lit up the screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Maddie." Her voice was tight, brittle at the edges. "We just saw Mom," I said evenly. "We can talk later." I ended the call. Nathaniel's laughter was soft, low, the kind that felt like quiet victory. "You know this is only the beginning," he said. I nodded. "I know." As the sun dipped lower, we took the yacht farther out away from the shore until it was just sea and sky and the steady hum of the engine beneath our feet. I leaned against the railing, closed my eyes, and breathed in the salt air. In Seattle, the wedding march would be starting. Victoria would be walking down the aisle holding Garrett's arm. But it didn't matter anymore. Because while their world was crumbling, mine was only just beginning to rise. Victoria called me on a rainy Thursday evening. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the sharpness I had always known, replaced by something hollow. "Maddie, I need to see you." For a moment I said nothing. I let the silence stretch because I wanted her to feel it. But then I gave her an address. 2 hours later, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find my sister standing in the hallway, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. Her once perfect posture bent, like she was carrying the weight of everything she had lost. She wasn't wearing designer clothes, no diamond earrings, just Victoria looking smaller than I had ever seen her. I stepped aside. She walked in without a word and sat at my kitchen table. I poured her a cup of coffee and set it down in front of her. She didn't touch it. "Garrett's company is gone," she said finally, her voice trembling. "We had to sell the house, the cars, the accounts are empty." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. I didn't ask if she was okay. She wasn't, and she knew I knew it. Victoria's eyes darted up to mine, desperate. "Maddie, please. I don't know where else to turn." I studied her for a long moment. For years she had been untouchable, the golden child, who could do no wrong while I sat at the edge of every family gathering like an afterthought. And now here she was, sitting in my kitchen, asking for me. "What exactly do you want from me?" I asked. Her lips trembled. "Help. Just anything." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how inevitable it felt. I stepped closer, placing my hands flat on the table, and looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not here to take revenge on you, Victoria." She blinked, stunned. "I'm not going to punish you. I just don't need you to define my worth anymore." Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. Instead, tears welled up, spilling over and tracing black lines of mascara down her cheeks. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice raw. "I thought I had it all figured out. I thought, Garrett, I thought I was better than you." I didn't flinch. I didn't move to comfort her. "Do you know what it felt like, Maddie?" She asked, her words breaking apart as if they were too heavy. "To stand there on my wedding day and see you with him, Nathaniel Brooks. Everyone was looking at you. Not me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the center." I stared at her. That wasn't the point. It had never been about her. But I let her keep talking because I wanted her to hear herself. "And now Garrett?" She choked on his name. "He's not the man I married. He's angry. He's bitter. He blames me for everything, and maybe he's right." I tilted my head. "Are you asking me for help because you're scared of losing him, or because you're scared of losing yourself?" She didn't answer. Maybe she didn't know. Instead, she broke. She pressed her hands over her face and sobbed like a child. The sound of it filled my kitchen, raw and unrestrained. I stood there and watched. Not cruelly, not with satisfaction, just still. Because I understood something in that moment. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It wasn't about Garrett. It wasn't even about the years of being overlooked. This was about me standing in my own life without needing her approval ever again. When Victoria finally looked up, her eyes were swollen and red, her voice small. "I'm sorry, Maddie. For the wedding, for the way I treated you, for all of it." I didn't speak. I let the silence sit between us like a verdict. She searched my face for anger, for forgiveness, for anything at all, but I gave her nothing. And that nothing was louder than any words I could have said. Victoria wiped at her cheeks and laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I used to think you wanted to be me." I shook my head slowly. "No. I just wanted to stop being invisible." Her eyes dropped, and for the first time in our lives, she had nothing left to argue with. We sat there for a long time, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the rain against the window. I could see her realizing that I wasn't going to swoop in and fix this for her. Finally, she stood shaky, but composed enough to hide it. "I should go." I nodded. At the door, she hesitated. "Maddie, thank you for at least letting me in." I didn't answer. She left without another word, and the door clicked shut behind her. I turned back to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, and for the first time in years I felt completely weightless. Because I hadn't won by crushing her. I had won by no longer needing to. Seattle was colder than I remembered, but this time I didn't feel it. Nathaniel's hand was warm in mine as we stepped into the grand ballroom of the Sterling Hotel, the chandeliers glittering like constellations overhead. Conversations quieted for a brief moment when we entered, just long enough for every pair of eyes that used to look past me to finally stop and stare. My parents were near the front, dressed in their finest. Charles stood straighter than I had seen in years, and Eleanor's expression was tight, almost unreadable, until she saw me walking beside Nathaniel. Something in her gaze softened then, as if for the first time she was seeing me clearly. Victoria was there too, standing a little apart from Garrett. She didn't meet my eyes, and I didn't need her to. Nathaniel and I moved through the crowd, effortlessly greeted by business leaders, investors, and old acquaintances, who suddenly seemed to remember my name. It wasn't loud recognition, not applause or cheers. It was the quiet shift in the room, the unspoken acknowledgement that I no longer stood in anyone's shadow. Eleanor approached me slowly, her hands clasped like she was holding herself together. For a long second, she just looked at me. "Maddie," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I am proud of you." I held her gaze. I didn't need that approval anymore, but hearing it was like closing a door I had been waiting years to shut. I smiled, small but certain. "Thank you, Mom." Behind her, I saw Lily. She slipped through the crowd and hugged me tightly, her voice low so only I could hear. "I knew you would win," she whispered. I didn't laugh, but I smiled wider this time. Not because I had won anything from Victoria or Garrett, or even from my parents. I had won myself back. As the evening went on, Nathaniel spoke with a group of executives while I stood near the balcony overlooking downtown Seattle. The city glittered below the same skyline I once stared at, with a hollow ache in my chest. Now there was only quiet. Victoria came near but didn't speak. For a brief moment her eyes met mine. There was no anger there, no pride, only a weary kind of acceptance. She turned away first. That was enough. Eleanor eventually joined Nathaniel and me, introducing us to a few family friends, as if it had always been this way. No one dared say otherwise. No one dared question it. And in that silence, I felt it. The recognition I had chased my whole life was never going to come with applause. It came in the way no one dared to doubt me anymore. Later that night, Nathaniel and I left the event and walked down to the quiet streets where the city lights reflected in the wet pavement. He glanced at me, a knowing look in his eyes. "This feels different," he said. "It is," I answered. For a long moment we simply stood there, the hum of Seattle around us, the air cold but sharp and clean. Sometimes silence is not empty. Sometimes silence is the loudest sound in the world. If you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever been told you didn't belong, remember this. You do not need permission to stand where you were always meant to be.